Hi everyone, as you know, the theme of Unscripted conference is how we simplify and scale software delivery. So I'm very excited to welcome in this panel some of the top industry leaders in software engineering. These leaders are from Atlassian, HashiCorp, GitHub, Jenkins, and CNCF. And I really can't imagine a more qualified group of people to talk about, when it comes to software delivery. Let's start with some introductions here. So we'll go around the room and we can do this in alphabetical order. So how about you? We start with you, Armon.
Sure, awesome. Well, thanks so much for hosting and having us. My name's Armon Dadgar. I'm one of the co-founders of HashiCorp along with Mitchell Hashimoto. And we focus as a company on really cloud infrastructure automation. So it's a very broad focus. I think more people know us for probably our tools than for the company. So probably our most well-known tools are things like Terraform, Vagrant, Vault, Consul, Nomad, Packer. And so those tend to be the tools people know us by, but really broad focus on enabling cloud infrastructure through automation.
Jason?
Hey everybody, I'm Jason Warner. I'm the CTO at GitHub. Prior to GitHub, I was at Heroku, and prior to Heroku, I was at Canonical. People make Ubuntu Linux. So I think you can see the theme of my last 10 to 12 years or so, basically developers and platforms. If you don't know what GitHub does, so basically brought Git to the world and then tried to expand the software development pipeline horizontally with things like GitHub Actions and things like that. So if you don't know us, give us a look. You might like us.
I don't think there's anyone out there who doesn't know who GitHub is. And actually, everything that all of you guys do, so Kohsuke, you next, and everyone knows who you are as well, but please introduce yourself.
I don't think, after Jason, like it's difficult to claim, but I'm probably best known as the creator of the Jenkins project, but now I'm the co-CEO of a new startup that I'm working on. It's called Launchable. And I'm tackling the problem that I had in the past 15 years, which is if you're making a small change to a large system, like why is it that we have to wait for the whole test to complete and it's taking hours? And let's just run the test that matters. And then that's going to reduce the time so that I can get working on the next problem more quickly. So that's what I'm working on.
Priyanka?
Awesome, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Priyanka, and I'm the General Manager of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, or CNCF. I've been involved in the Cloud Native ecosystem from the very beginning, first as a project contributor, then as a governing board member, and finally now as the General Manager leading the foundation. CNCF hosts some of the most critical open source projects in infrastructure technology. Some names you may be familiar with are Kubernetes, Prometheus, Envoy Proxy, Jaeger. In total, we host 70 plus projects, and we're a foundation of doers where the team Cloud Native, which is what you see on my virtual background, is working hard all the time to innovate with here as ground zero of cloud native innovation. Every contribution counts here, and if you're interested in learning more, checking us out, a great place would be our flagship event, KubeCon, that is in November.
Okay, thank you, Priyanka. Shri?
Thanks, Jyoti. Thanks for having me here. Shri Viswanath, CTO of Atlassian. I've been at Atlassian for about 5 years or so. Before that, I was at Sun Microsystems and Groupon and Ning, which was Mark Anderson's third company and such. Atlassian's mission is to unleash potential of every team. We build team collaboration products. You might know Jira, Confluence, Trello, Bitbucket. We have several more products. And over the last few years, we have moved all our on-prem software to becoming a cloud native company. So excited to be here.
Hey, welcome everyone. You guys are also deeply in software and DevOps world for so many years and brought some of the top innovations to the industry. You've talked about almost most of the products that the software developers in the world use. We talked about them in your intros already. So my question for all of you, first question is, what do you think is broken in today's software delivery and software engineering experience? And what do we improve from here? Have you achieved already everything, or what do we improve from here?
We can all go back home.
It's a good joke, Jyoti.
I'm happy to kick us off. I don't know if there was an order you wanted to go through here.
Let's go around the room. How about we start with you, Shri, and in the inverse order?
Sure, absolutely. Overall, I think there's number of things that are broken. I guess our industry is great in solving hard problems and also great at creating interesting projects for ourselves by breaking other things. I would say the biggest thing right now is the whole surface area is like super wide for engineers, right? And it's complicated and complex, right? In terms of the number of things that you need to know, disparate things to be able to take and write a single line of code, solve your problem, starting with your IDE all the way to production. It's becoming more complicated, not less complicated. And the challenge that happens is, as we have moved as an industry from being in a monolith where you know where your code is and what you run, to getting to microservices and getting to cloud and having all these running in production, like it's become near impossible to say what's running in production and what line of code this I wrote this version, but do you know if it's running in production? Like the life has become really complicated.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. If I may, I absolutely agree with you. On a macro level, I would say that software delivery, when we think about improvements to it, often we think about it in a moment of time. So today, something may be wrong, but this is really a continuum. So 5 years ago, we were talking about what is microservices, what are containers. Today, we are talking about challenges where things are so complex we don't know. Over time, an issue has been that there's a lack of connection between the end users and the developers developing software for them. And this affects the software delivery lifecycle significantly, because if you don't know who you're building for, no matter what tools you use, how improved your process is, you're in a vacuum. And I think I hear about this from developers who work on cloud native pretty much every day, where they're like, whether it's an open source project they're working on or internally, they just don't feel connected enough to the customer experience. And I think that's an ongoing continuous problem that we have to solve. Just like software delivery is a continuum where we keep improving, we find new problems, and we keep moving through.
So I was thinking about what Sri was saying, and I think it's not only like our surface is big, but it's also like different from like a one team to next, and we also lack the same language to talk about these things. So I kind of enjoy talking to different software development teams, and like I'm just always surprised like how they use different words to describe the same thing. And I'm sure everyone has this experience, like you go from one place to the next, like you feel like a complete newbie, So it's just I don't know. I feel like the rest of the world in other professions, they must be doing a little better than how we are doing things.
It's a very good point. Like sometimes I look at some of the other professions like sales and marketing, and they're a bit more defined. Like you hire you have a head of sales joins an organization, and they know what to do, and very quickly they can bring a lot of the different tools and practices. And in the software engineering, we have to it takes so long to find the right kind of tools and practices and get things going. Right? Yeah. Jason, what do you think?
I mean, my answer is super simple. I think it's YAML. So could you just stop right there and move on? No, to a large degree, I think that everyone's captured the spirit of what's going on, which is, I view that basically software goes through abstraction layers, but also goes through expansions and then contractions again. And I think that we're going through an expansion. The Cloud Native Foundation is a good example of this, where the Cloud Native Foundation landscape is showing that things are happening. This proliferation of tooling is out there. But in fact, that's a good thing from an industry perspective, but it's a very hard thing to wrangle. And we're trying to understand what tooling we have where and how and who is using it, and then visibility into it. And what happens if you think about what orgs look like, well, it looks like this in our stacks too, is that there's organizations are layers of horizontals and verticals, and you're trying to figure out how best to put these blocks together. Software is the exact same thing. We have to introduce new constructs around it, and we're just not doing that yet. I think that overall, what we're going to go to is obviously a more horizontal experience for developers and then operators at the same time. And then we're going to connect those together at some point. And once we connect that together, we're going to work on the next expansive and contractive phase.
And Armon, what do you think? Do you agree with that YAML is the problem we got to solve?
Oh, I mean, I think HashiCorp has a well-known anti-YAML bias, but I think in some sense, echoing a bunch of the points that have been made here, in some sense, I feel like one of the biggest disservices was sort of this early notion of DevOps, this definition that I feel like we're still fighting to this day, which is what DevOps means is that the dev and ops is the same person. and that your developer is suddenly going to love using operator tooling. And I think it's like that couldn't be further from the truth, right? And when I think about the software HashiCorp makes, like it's tools designed for operators, right? And I'll include things like Kubernetes in that as well. It's like they're complex for a reason because they're solving a complex problem. They're designed for someone who's an operator persona. And I think we sort of used DevOps as this excuse to be like, great, developers should just use this stuff. They're gonna love it. And the reality is they hate it, right? I talk all the time, it's, me and Mitchell joke that 10 years ago when you wanted to deploy, you FTP'd into your server, you copy pasted your Apache files, and that was your deploy. That's how easy it was. And now it's like you write YAML, the template's other YAML that's like meta YAML, and it's like you don't even know what the hell you're doing anymore. And so I think there's this sort of truth to this, which is like, I think what DevOps we sort of forgot is that like the developers don't want to be operators by and large. I think there's a few of them, right? There's certainly some developers who like and want to straddle both roles, but by and large, developers don't want to deal with that stuff, right? And we've sort of foisted it upon them.
So we all agree that the developer experience has gotten more complex, and we all agree that we need to do significantly better from here. So what do you think is the solution? What do we need to improve? How do we fix the complexity in developer lives?
All right. So I think the problem set spans across the whole spectrum, starting from individuals to teams to the company. So if you look at individuals, software engineers are thinking about the technical problems to solve and how do we solve it. And then as you get to the team, there's a lot of collaboration that's involved and code reviews that you need to do. And then as you get to the organization company, we need to get the outcome that we need, right? And we need to satisfy the customers, and we need to make sure that the customers get the value. And that's the reason we are building the whole thing. And if you move in the spectrum, the technical aspects are more important than the beginning, and then becomes the collaboration aspects, and then the culture of the company itself. So it depends on where we are on the spectrum of discussion.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. An example I can share is from my experience at GitLab. I used to work over there before, and I did cloud native alliances, among other things. So GitLab was moving to Kubernetes. And at first it was all about like, what's the latest tooling? How can we make it snazzy? What's the fanciest experience possible? But then actually we realized that wasn't the most effective strategy. And what we did was we stayed on the current, what at the time infrastructure was, and pushed it to the limit while changing the developer workflows and processes for the software development and delivery lifecycle. So that means that suddenly engineers were having to collaborate with the operators, with the security folks. Every engineer was on call. And there was a lot of friction to getting that going. And it was a really good idea to decouple the process development from the tooling chain, because otherwise it's just unmanageable. You have like two fires at the same time. And it took us some time, but we got very good at it, and the culture change started happening. And at that point, we brought in the new tooling, moved everything to Kubernetes, and that move was extremely smooth. So I totally believe that it is a workflow and change management story, and then the tooling comes in and just puts steroids to the success.
So I think about the blessing and the curse of being a developer is like we can solve the problem. So like we go right ahead and roll up the sleeve and start solving the problem. And like I fail to bring like a larger resources of the society or the organization at play. So in other words, like a money and time. Like I meet too often like people who are doing heroic work without nobody else knowing anything about it. So I think if we can sort of start to talk about the right words and so on, so that we can bring the rest of the organization along with you, so that they understand and they can help you solve the problem, I think we can make a much bigger impact.
Yeah, and I just will echo. I think we see all the time the because we can solve it, let's go solve it, right? Attitude, and I think this is how you end up with a massive proliferation of tools. But I think part of the challenge is how do you step back and ask, are we solving the right problems to begin with? And I know Jason talked about this earlier, the sort of vertical versus horizontal orientation. And I think what sometimes happens is you get developers who are in this sort of like local minima building tools for this sort of process. And so it's like, how do I build a tool that helps me push this rock up this hill a little bit faster? Versus when you sort of step back and ask yourself, like, should you be pushing the rock at all? Is there a different approach, right? I think what's clear is you're sometimes solving the wrong problem. So I think to your question on sort of like, what can we as an industry do to like improve developer experience? Mm-hmm. I think you kind of have to start with the developer experience, right? You kind of have to start with what should that be? Okay, that's the problem we're trying to solve, and let's backfit everything into that, rather than like, okay, we have this operator tool that's complicated, so let's write this meta layer that's like maybe 1% less complicated, but now you have to understand both layers, and there's abstractional leakage. So actually the net effect was it was net even more complicated than what you started with, right? And I think this is what happens when you have this sort of narrow blinder, like just keep building, right? It becomes the sort of Tower of Babel.
Yeah. Do you think we should just ask developers to stop building their own tools all the time? Because one thing I see, like, you go into DevOps conferences and events, and like people come in and we spend last 1 year or 2 years to build our own tooling to do this. And, obviously they build something good and they're very proud of presenting it. But then I see this and like, okay, you have like 10 different companies presenting the same things. And like, another, like, you go to the next DevOps event and another 10, 15 people who have done the same thing. Is it really good for anyone? Because we can, as developers, is that the right thing to do, as you phrase? And that's maybe that's one thing you have to kind of encourage that's maybe it's not the right thing to do. Like, if you can, doesn't mean like, you should. What do you think, Jason? What do we need to do?
I don't think we should stop anybody from developing things. What I think we should do is we should recognize when common patterns and themes have come out, and we can say, hey, that looks really good. Let's figure out why that works that way. Good example of this is the common light bulb story that we hear, that it wasn't just Edison who made the light bulb. There are 7 light bulbs around the world that kind of emerged at the same time. And I think the common theory is that the world was ready for the light bulb. Well, in our industry, whenever I walk into an organization of any sufficient scale, I say, just point me to wherever you're trying to make your own Heroku. Because every company is trying to make their own Heroku. And it's not because they shouldn't, but if the world's ready for PaaSes like Heroku, and people need and they have the tooling like Kubernetes or Terraform or others like it, they can put together and they can say, hey, we're going to do something that looks like this. It doesn't mean they should stop, but they should go back to that first principle and say, is this going to matter to us, or should we kind of go to a different direction, buy it from somebody, or adopt some of the patterns that we see in other places? I do think that there's an interesting industry trend, which is bottoms-up software adoption via developers. And I think that taken to its logical conclusion means that internally in organizations, they will always develop all of their things themselves because they'll just basically consume open source to fully develop everything. I think we need to find the sweet spot between consuming some open source, consuming some CNCF projects, consuming some industry projects, and adopting some other things together. That's where I was saying before about this expand and contract. I think we're kind of going through another expand phase at the moment.
I would agree with Jason 100%. As a foundation, we see this a lot, right? Like all kinds of projects coming out. And my perspective is that it depends on the stage of commoditization of a technology. So if no developers ever built their own tooling, we wouldn't have amazing projects like Envoy Proxy and Jaeger, which are both used by so many people at this time, right? And they've been really positive for the ecosystem. However, if somebody was looking at container orchestration, which is the space Kubernetes plays in, at this point, it's matured. And at this point, it is my humble opinion that would be not very useful for somebody to go build something from scratch. So I think it's really important to see what is the ecosystem around you, particularly open source, and that's because folks from other end user companies can present projects there that may match your needs, and then decide whether you should go build your own thing. I do think the developer urge to create is an awesome, beautiful thing, and we should never stop it. We should just be smart about what we're building.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the lens that I see, at least when I talk to engineers, is let's focus on the customer problem. What are we trying to solve for the customers? And if there are tools that are available, let's leverage the tools and add value on top, right? And if it doesn't solve the problem, absolutely, we should go build it. Or if it's unique and if we are solving something doesn't exist, absolutely build those. And it's actually good to have lots of these flowers bloom so that some of them becomes really good and popular and open source. Plus, the other revolution that's happening is we have these SaaS companies that give point products that may seem niche, but when you are as a developer building these days, you are becoming more assembling things. And it used to be libraries that you assemble. You also assemble services that are there, right? And the mindset that you need is, it's not just assembling things, but you need to architect things as you do this. So what happens is when you build the software, it's adding to the value. And especially as a multi-product company, like we think about having number of products and how do we have a platform underneath that all these different products can leverage. And we try to pull in the common services into the platform so that multiple products can do it. So even the engineers inside the company act as if they are building products for multiple of the products that are inside the company.
Well, and I think I love your point on sort of like the business outcome and thinking of those different granularities, right? From the individual all the way to the team to like, are we achieving the organizational outcome, right? And then I think if you use that as the North Star, which is like, are we adding value to our end user, our end customer? Then maybe the answer is you need to build that homegrown tool, right? And I think, you know, on sort of reframing the question outside of infrastructure, I think sometimes makes it a little more obvious, which is like, should every business write their own database? You know, I think if you sort of ask that question, you'd be like, pretty obviously the answer is no. You know, if you spent all of your engineering time rebuilding, you know, Postgres, not necessarily great for customer outcome, right? And I think sometimes we fall into that trap sort of operationally, right? Where we sort of lose track because it's shiny and exciting. And, you know, I think there's a sort of a joke tag, which is sort of like resume driven development, right? And I think there is an element of that allure. But I think when you zoom out and say, okay, well, you wouldn't write your own database. So like, why would you write your own container orchestration, you know, tool? It's sort of the same question, right? And so I think, you know, keeping that North Star of it's about the customer value, maybe there's areas where we need to create something differentiated, something custom to deliver that value. Great, there's a justification for it. But if it's just building to sort of pad the resume, you know, you're not really driving business outcome.
Yeah, great points there. You know, I think it's looks like you know, engineers drive a lot of innovations. We got to have you know, the thousandth flower bloom, as Shri said, like where like all of these things happening. But you know, people who are building this, they have to think about the business outcome. If otherwise we are just doing the same things again and again and again, and you know, it's a hard thing though. Like, you know, developers many times would be convinced that, you know, that there is a better way of doing it, which is what, you know, what makes them a good developer. So that's always the challenging part of it. The business outcome as the North Star is, I do think that's what the industry has to embrace there, right? So
and the other thing, Jyoti, that resonates with me is you mentioned how sales team can have a cookbook and roll this. Our industry just cannot, because it's changing so fast. I remember the story. Einstein was teaching in Oxford and he gave an exam and he's walking back to his office with his teaching assistant, and the teaching assistant asked, "Dr. Einstein, you gave the same question second year in a row." And he's like, yeah. And he's like, "But you gave the same question for the same student second year in a row." And he's like, yeah, but the answers changed. So that's what is happening for us, right? So the same tool that was built a year ago, they're trying to solve the problem has changed now. It seems like you're in the same landscape, but our industry is moving so fast that you'll have to have multiple of these, because you'll have to keep up with the problem set and the answers that are like the solutions that are moving. Our industry is changing rapidly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think if the North Star is based on outcomes, and we hear about these outcomes on the at least on the software delivery performance, you know, from Accelerate and things like that, right? Which is the metrics. How do you measure? And then you can use them as North Star for an engineering organization around lead time from a requirement to by the time you can ship something to your consumers, you know, deployment frequency, change failure rate, and mean time to recover from when problems happen, right? What do you guys think is the most important metric out of these? Are these the right metrics? How we should, or the industry should set as North Star? And if you have to pick few, how would you like to run engineering organizations?
So I mean, in the CIC, somebody from the CI/CD space, those metrics in that Accelerate book is so great. But like one metrics that I got really impressed that somebody taught me is the developer happiness. Like they have this internal employee surveys, and then so because I think I talked to this about a little bit that I think we the developers are not great at rallying the rest of the organization around. So I think it's their attempt to try to capture how they're feeling when they are not so good at expressing themselves. And I think they're surprisingly on point about what needed to be done. And then I also felt like the developer here must feel good that, like, their boss is accountable for the happiness of their engineers. So I think that's something more of us should think about.
There's a survey from, I believe, from Stripe called the Stripe Developer Coefficient, I think it is, and it talks about deploy frequency and how good the company is from a revenue perspective, and how they actually match between them. If they deploy more frequently, the company, for whatever reasons, tends to do better, and less frequently. And obviously, correlation, not causation type of scenario. But what I'm really wanting to say here is that I care about two metrics pretty heavily, and not because of the metrics, but because of what it means if you've done those metrics well for you as to be a proficient engineering organization. So deploy frequency and mean time to recovery to me are very meaningful. The more often that you can deploy safely, and you've done the hard work to get to the point where your organization and your technology can deploy very frequently, and then when you have a fault, how quickly can you recover to get back to green, and then also get that back into the system to get fixed. And I know that you mentioned 4 total, but I care very deeply about those 2. And I do believe, even if you think about startups to mature organizations, think about this as experimentation. The more times that you have to experiment with something, the more likely you're going to have a good outcome. So if you only experiment with your customers once every 6 months, we know that that's not the greatest place to be. But if you can customer test every week with new deployments or every day, you're experimenting at a more rapid pace. You're increasing your own survival rate chance.
And as long as you have the ability to recover fast if the experiment fails.
Yes, that's why those 2 need to be together. Otherwise, you are in
Few thoughts on this. We did a survey at Atlassian asking exactly the same question you asked to a broad set of customers, like developers, and 93% said, those 4 seems like good set of metrics. And 60% of them said, oh, but we can't measure it correctly, or it doesn't help us because there's no way to normalize across the company, right? So I step back from that and say, what are you trying to solve, right? What are you trying to optimize for your company? And it also depends on what stage the company is in. So one metric may not fit every company in terms of where they are. You need to talk about people, right? Building the organization. Maybe it's not the velocity initially that's important. You need to build the right balanced team that you need to have. Then you need to go think about predictability. Maybe you are shipping on time, so you want to make sure that you ship on time. So there's different aspects of it. Then you need to get quality, and then you get to velocity, right? So there's different aspects at different points of time. And plus we talked about this moving to microservices, and this change into cloud has actually complicated what it means, because many of this thing, when you say lead time, it goes into production, but in dark mode. Like if 90% of your customers haven't seen the value, have you actually shipped it? Right? So relating back to Atlassian, the way we think about this is we look at story cycle time, right? Which is slightly one level abstraction above lead time. And it's not just that a line of code that you wrote runs in production. It's a customer story. How long does it take? Let's say you ballpark everything at the same scope. How long does it take to get into production in the hands of customer? Right? And we try to optimize and see if we can bring that smaller. And that's one of the metrics, I should say. That's number 1 on my list, but there's a bunch of other ones we track depending on the teams, but that seems like the most important, adding customer value at the end.
I'd like to echo that. I feel like I have such a mind meld going on with you, Shri, over here. This is amazing. During Cloud Native and before, I have a background in observability. So I've thought a lot about these metrics, etc. While I've never run large engineering teams, I've also been talking a lot about this question with folks in our project maintainer group who look at projects like Jaeger, Prometheus, Fluentd, who are often thinking about what's the right metric. And so at the end of the day, right, like what's the business outcome? What is going to make your customer happy? And software is in service of that goal. And as Shri was saying, right, at a different company stage and even product type or company type, it differs what that means. And so something I saw very successful in the past was when people connected tactical metrics to business things that were happening, such as for a particular type of feature, are there more help desk tickets, or is that going down over time? If there's a top customer, what is their, like, how many times are they calling? How many times are they just having a lovely experience? If it's a shopping cart, like shopping cart abandons, like, so that's like the business thing, and you need to tie the engineering metrics to that. And as companies grow, of course, complexities increase and, you know, things change, but I think that maniacal focus is really important. And then something I think at the end of the day that keeps us all on track, and this is very much me channeling the maintainers that I often talk to, is the key SLOs and SLAs, right? Like, you have to stay within error budgets and how much service latency you're going to accept, but it should probably be shared across teams. Not one team has its own. And it's not just about like, hey, I chose metric A, B, C versus PQR, but rather how am I operationalizing those metrics? As she said, like, some are not even measurable, others are not shared. So we have to connect every metric with the business outcome, or maybe rather start with the business outcome and then work backwards. So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, I like that. I'll keep harping on business outcome all day, so I totally agree with you. I mean, I think a framework that I really love, I think this actually comes out of the Department of Defense, is what they refer to as sort of the OODA loop concept, right? It's sort of like, how long does it take you to sort of observe your reality, orient to it, decide on your action, and then implement some action, right? And, you know, I think they describe this OODA loop, which sort of, you know, each one of those pieces might have different metrics, right? Like, you know, if you talk about orient, that might be around, you know, how long does it take you to drive stakeholder alignment? And that has a lot to do with how your org is structured and, you know, how decision-making is made. What's your internal consensus building process, right? When you talk about, you know, acting, right? That might take you into questions like, you know, what's your lead time? What's your deploy frequency, et cetera. So, you know, I think any one of the sort of low-level metrics, it's hard to say which is sort of the right one. I think if you zoom all the way out to sort of the business outcome view, then I like that sort of OODA loop concept, which is sort of, it's that cycle time. I think this ties a bit into what Shri was saying with sort of the user story. You can think about a user story as sort of one iteration of that loop. It's like, we've observed this user problem, great, we've oriented around it and sort of architected a solution. You know, we've committed to this user story, that was the decide, and now the act is we have to go implement the user story, right? So you can think about it as like one rev of the loop. So, you know, I like that if you measure that user story or think about it as that time of how long does it take you to react, you know, orient, decide, and act end to end. And there's a bunch of sub metrics in there to support it, but no one of them, I think, you know, if you're really, really fast at deciding and really slow at acting, you know, or vice versa, yeah, it doesn't really help you.
Yeah, I think that's amazing points there. It looks like we have to align everything to business outcomes, and, you know, business outcomes then have to drive like the metrics underneath there. And that's been a challenge in the world of software, like, you know, people not thinking about business outcomes that much, and the alignment lost into the underlying metrics taking over, you know, before the business outcomes are discussed. It's surprising to me though, like, you know, it's like I look at other functions, they're much more measurable and much more more metrics driven. And we look at software engineering and we all kind of like say as industry, like, oh, software engineering is hard to measure and that's the one we should not measure. It's a bit too creative and it's hard to measure. And sometimes I question that, like, is it really true? Like, you know, we are software engineers and we should probably have the most measurable systems of some kind. And it's, but it looks like there's a lot of work you have to do as an industry to, like, can we really measure, and what are the right measurability things to get better? Otherwise, people will keep doing things without the context of metrics and business outcomes. Right?
I mean, I think what Shri pointed out, like measuring like the cycle time of a user story is I think a very concrete thing that you can measure, right? You know, what's tough is I think some of the stuff, if you try to say, okay, well, what's the outcome of this user story to my revenue, right? There's sort of like, there's a question mark, right? I think there's a gap between, okay, yeah, I can measure a user story and quantify that, but you know, this downstream impact is not directly quantifiable. And so I think that part of it is hard, and I'm not sure if there's ever going to be sort of a fix to that. It's sort of like, you know, the attribution problem, you know, that's sort of fundamental on the marketing side. Yeah. So I think some of those are unsolvable, but I think having a crisp idea of like a user story, being able to quantify that end to end, and it's not just the development part of that process, it's all the other pieces. I mean, you know, I don't know, speaking for others, but at least internally, I know a huge piece of it can be stakeholder alignment, right? When you have, you know, a large organization, just getting everybody aligned can actually be more work than the implementation. The implementation might be a fraction of that time. So I think, having that measurability, I think, is valuable.
Yep, I agree.
I think about there are a lot of things that's hard to measure, but when I also think about like what are the things, like if you actually analyze data, like what can we do about it to actually like tangibly help the lives of developers? I think there's no shortages of things. I talked to quite a bit of folks who are doing something like that, and that's one of the things I'm doing in this new company Launchable. So I'm studying there. Like I'm trying to help the fellow developer by using data, and then if I eventually get to more business level meaningful things, that's great. But even before we get there, it's really useful.
I agree. I think now there is access to more data, so hopefully there could be more intelligence could be built out of that data to answer some of these questions.
Yeah.
So my last question here for everyone here is like, if you look at so much change has happened in the last 5-7 years. Like when I was let's say coding something 7 years ago, everything looked so different. Like on compared to like how if I have to code today, what would I do? Right? You have containers and Kubernetes and everything in the cloud. Everything is code and lots and lots of YAML everywhere as a so. If you have a crystal ball and say, okay, from 5 years from now, what would be the new exciting things that the world of software developers and engineering would be talking about? What does your crystal ball say?
I mean, I guess I've always been sort of the view that this stuff is kind of plumbing, right? So it's like, hopefully, if we do our job well, we're not talking about it, right? I think our view is really infrastructure is there to enable sort of the innovation that happens on top. So, ideally, it's like we get that to such a sort of level of polish and it just sort of works. It's really more about, hey, here's all the cool companies that you see being built on top. I think to me, some of the stuff I get most excited about is I look at like kind of like Shopify and, even what Airtable is sort of doing around this notion of how do you broaden the digital economy and bring people in who aren't developers, but want to be sort of digital entrepreneurs. So to me, that's the kind of stuff I hope we're talking about, right? And hopefully not, another YAML templating tool.
Yeah, I look at it as this is actually an exciting time in technology, right? There's so much changing. If I zoom forward 5 years, I guess, right now, most of you have instructions and you have data on the side. With ML and AI coming in as core part of it, it becomes a data flow machine, right? So it's a combination of both how you think about writing your code traditionally that you have written versus starting with data as the center and building it out. But there's another thing that's coming into the same mix with all the regulations happening around data. So this thing about ML, AI, data with regulations and privacy coming in, that's super interesting on how tools are built, how you look at solving a customer problem. It's a complete paradigm shift. And the way you develop today won't be the same 5 years from now, especially given data becomes critical and there's all these regulations. You can see some of those data, but you still need to build your models that needs to run on it. And that's super exciting. The other thing that also happens is because the whole software development is a team sport, like there's going to be software that is a lot more collaborative, right? We spend a lot of time at Atlassian just making sure that the online, offline collaboration becomes easy. And that needs to be part of the tooling, which is not today. It's a bit clunky on how you shift between online tooling versus offline human interaction back to online tuning. That needs to be like smoothened out in terms of how we can efficiently build software. And I have a bunch more, but it seems like let's stop there.
I agree with what Armon is saying, right? Like we're effectively talking about plumbing here, so hopefully it'll all kind of be sorted. Something that might lead us there, which would have great developer experience, could be like cloud native IDEs, which have code-ready workspaces, like GitHub code spaces and Gitpod. With the idea being that there is no toil setting up environments and this and that, and it's just a simple IDE experience that's shareable with your peers and it's all ready. And so the plumbing is behind the scenes and you don't have to worry about it. And I really think in 5 years, things will be a lot, at least close to that. I think in addition to the simplification of the developer experience, there will be like the verticalization of cloud native will have probably gotten much further along. So for example, lots of like, for many things like Kubernetes are a household name. However, we work a lot with like the telco companies where we are trying to move them to cloud native network functions from virtual networking functions. And that's a huge momentous thing that's going on. And I think it will take the next 5 years for us to really have that sorted out, because that like that big bastion of technology that's telco. And I think there's so many, like it goes from, like a general experience to verticalization, even in terms of workflows workloads where we're seeing a lot of froth now in edge deployments. Everybody's talking about edge devices and IoT, and 5G is going to make it bigger, of course. But I think that cloud native on the edge will become, right now we're seeing like Kubernetes is starting to support it with K3s, KubeEdge, etc. But that'll have become, in my opinion, quite more mainstream. And then let's see what all happens.
What do you think, Jason?
There's a lot of advancements in a lot of areas here right now. And so I think that what we're going to see is that micro ecosystems kind of emerge and iterate very quickly, and then they come back together. And that's when I think from a horizontal and vertical perspective, we'll see a new horizontal lay down. A good example is what we were talking about with the edge. Edge, there's a lot of stuff going on over there right now, but right now you have to choose between a cloud, actually, between even hybrid or multi, let alone functions and compute versus cloud, edge cloud, and that won't be the case in the future. Something will emerge that allows you to just do it seamlessly. But then we haven't even talked about WebAssembly. WebAssembly is going to change the game entirely on the front end, and then you got CRDTs and what are happening on real-time communication at that level there. There's a lot of stuff that's going to happen. But the one principle I say for whenever I'm talking to large organizations is that the fashion of software changes faster than you can actually consume. So you do need to figure out what you're anchoring on. And so obviously we all represent a corporation here, and we believe that our corporation or a foundation, sorry.
All good.
But we all represent a corporation, so we feel that maybe our corporation should be the one that everyone anchors on. But the point being that you do need something to anchor on, because otherwise you're just adrift. So figure out what you're actually anchoring your organization on, and then you could actually be okay with some of the fashion changing.
100% agree with that.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Anchor on Kubernetes.
Kubernetes would just be plumbing 5 years from now. You don't need to know there's Kubernetes, right?
That's a good point. Yeah.
I think about maybe the more than the change itself, but our ability to make those changes. So like I think about this, like how our ability to collaborate, I think, has been getting better, like open source and like some of the GitHub, for example, like, and then so I think that continues. So whatever the changes coming on our way, I think we'll be better equipped. So I think that's the utopian, like optimistic version of where we'll be in 5 years is how I think.
How long you guys think it will take us to have a brain-computer interface between developers and code? Like, developers think of code and it's written through the interface. How far away are we from there?
Well, Elon's already pre-selling that.
Let's call Elon.
Well, maybe in 10 years we'll be there. Great. Hey, thank you so much for participating in this discussion. Really honored to have you participate in the Unscripted conference and sharing your perspectives, what's wrong and what's happening, what's going to happen in the next 5 years. So thank you again so much.